When Laura told me she was pregnant, I didn't feel the kind of joy I imagined I would when this moment arrived. Instead, I found myself staring at her, trying to decipher the expression on her face. She seemed distant, her smile faint, as though the words she had just spoken were merely an echo of something she'd practiced saying. The woman I loved, my wife of 3 years, was sitting across from me in our dimly lit kitchen, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The usual warmth in her voice was missing. "You pregnant?" I asked, my voice betraying the cocktail of emotions swirling within me. "Yes," she replied, glancing up briefly before lowering her gaze to the table. Her tone was flat, devoid of the excitement I had expected. I reached across the table to take her hand, but she pulled it away to grasp her coffee mug instead. "Laura, this is..." I hesitated, unsure how to phrase my next words. "This is amazing, right?" She nodded, but the gesture felt mechanical. There was a wall between us, one I couldn't see but could certainly feel. The room seemed to grow colder as my mind raced. Something was wrong, very wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The doubts crept in slowly, like shadows stretching as the sun sets. They started small. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she spoke, the way she had been staying later at work these past few months, and the way her phone seemed glued to her hand. She had been secretive lately, more so than usual. I had dismissed it as stress, chalking it up to the pressures of her demanding job. But now, with this announcement, my instincts screamed at me to dig deeper. Later that night, as Laura slept beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past 6 months. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. Her distant behavior, the hushed phone calls, and her sudden reluctance to make eye contact, it all pointed to something she wasn't telling me. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I glanced at her phone lying on the nightstand. My chest tightened as I wrestled with my conscience. Snooping wasn't something I believed in, but the nagging feeling that something was amiss was too strong to ignore. My fingers hovered over the device, but before I could act, Laura stepped out of the bathroom, startling me. I fumbled with the nightstand drawer, pretending to be looking for something. "What are you doing?" she asked, wrapping her towel tightly around herself. "Nothing," I lied, my heart pounding. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't press further. Instead, she grabbed her phone and left the room without another word. As the days passed, her behavior grew even more erratic. She avoided any discussions about the pregnancy, deflecting my questions with vague answers. One evening, as we sat watching TV, I broached the subject again. "Laura, we need to talk about this. About us. About the baby." She tensed visibly, her shoulders stiffening as she kept her eyes fixed on the screen. "Jacob, can't we just enjoy the moment?" she replied, her voice tight. "Enjoy the moment? You've barely spoken about it since you told me. I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes flashing with anger. "Not everything has to be a conspiracy, Jacob. Can't you just trust me?" Her words stung, but they didn't quell my suspicions. That night, I resolved to find out the truth. The following morning, I called in sick to work and decided to follow her. She had mentioned meeting a friend for brunch, but as I watched her from a distance, I saw her enter a hotel lobby instead. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I considered walking away, but the need for answers outweighed my fear of what I might find. I followed her inside, keeping my distance as she took the elevator to the 6th floor. When the doors closed, I stared at the floor indicator, watching it stop. I took the next elevator up, stepping out cautiously. The corridor was empty, save for the sound of a door closing in the distance. I walked slowly, my heart pounding with each step. Reaching the end of the hall, I heard muffled voices coming from behind a door. I froze, torn between knocking and leaving. Before I could decide, the door opened and a man stepped out, a man I didn't recognize. He looked startled to see me but quickly composed himself, offering a polite nod before walking away. My eyes darted to the room number as I stood rooted to the spot. It wasn't until later that night, after hours of internal turmoil, that I confronted Laura. She denied everything at first, her voice trembling as she tried to twist the narrative. "You're being paranoid, Jacob," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Why would you even think such a thing? But the cracks in her facade were clear. I pressed on, laying out every suspicion, every inconsistency. Finally, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I don't know if it's yours, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The air was sucked out of the room. I stared at her, unable to process her words. The woman I had planned a future with, the woman carrying what I thought was our child, had just shattered our world. And yet, amidst the betrayal, all I could feel was emptiness. Laura had always been the kind of person who kept her work life separate from her personal life. That was one of the things I admired about her, her ability to compartmentalize, to leave the stress of her demanding job at the door when she came home. But lately, it felt like she was bringing the office into our house. Her phone was always buzzing, the screen lighting up with notifications she was quick to dismiss. It wasn't just the frequency of the messages, it was the way she reacted to them, furtive glances, quick swipes, and the occasional half-smile that she tried to hide. One name kept popping up on her phone's screen, Michael. I'd heard her mention him a few times in passing, describing him as just a colleague. Nothing about the way she spoke of him raised any red flags. But now, I couldn't help but feel uneasy every time his name appeared. It started subtly. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch, her phone vibrated on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, her face briefly illuminated by the glow. The name Michael was there, along with a preview of the message, "You always know how to make me smile." She quickly picked up the phone and turned it face down on her lap. "Michael seems to text you a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Her eyes darted to mine, and for a split second I saw something there, guilt, maybe? But she recovered quickly, brushing it off with a laugh. "He's just venting about a work thing. It's nothing." Nothing. That word would haunt me in the weeks to come. Her behavior grew stranger as time passed. She started working late more often, claiming there was some big project her team was handling. At first, I wanted to believe her. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my doubts were just a byproduct of the tension we'd been feeling since the pregnancy announcement. But the late nights turned into weekend meetings, and her explanations became vaguer. One Saturday morning, as she was getting ready to leave, I decided to press her. "What's the project about?" I asked, watching her tie her hair back in the mirror. She paused for a moment, her fingers lingering in her hair tie. "It's just a client report. You wouldn't be interested, it's pretty dry stuff." "Try me," I said, forcing a smile. She turned to me, her expression hardening ever so slightly. "Jacob, I don't need to justify every minute of my day to you. It's work. That's all." Her defensiveness was like a punch to the gut. I didn't push further, but the unease settled deeper in my chest. The following week, while she was in the shower, I saw her laptop open on the dining table. The screen was still on, displaying her email inbox. I hesitated. Snooping wasn't something I ever thought I'd resort to, but the nagging feeling that something was off had become unbearable. I stepped closer, scanning the subject lines until one caught my eye. "Last night was amazing." It was from Michael. My hands trembled as I clicked on it, my heart pounding in my ears. The email was brief, almost innocuous, but it was enough to send my mind reeling. "I can't stop thinking about our conversation. You always know how to see the best in people, even me. Let's grab lunch again soon." My stomach churned. There was nothing explicit, nothing that outright screamed an affair, but the tone of the message was far too intimate for my liking. I closed the laptop and sat down, my head in my hands. When Laura came out of the shower, I watched her carefully, looking for any signs of guilt or deceit. But she acted as if everything was normal, humming to herself as she poured a cup of coffee. "Anything interesting on your laptop this morning?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She froze for the briefest moment, her back to me. "Just emails." "Why?" "No reason," I replied, studying her reaction. She turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper. I started paying closer attention to her phone, her emails, her behavior. I wasn't proud of it, but I felt like I had no other choice. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I walked up behind her quietly. She didn't notice me at first, too engrossed in whatever she was reading. When I leaned over to kiss her cheek, she quickly locked the screen and set the phone aside. "What were you looking at?" I asked, my voice as calm as I could manage. "Just Instagram," she said, smiling up at me. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, after she had fallen asleep, I picked up her phone from the nightstand. Her password hadn't changed, and my hands shook as I unlocked it. I navigated to her messages, scrolling past the usual threads with friends and family until I found Michael's name. The messages were like a dagger to the heart. They weren't overtly romantic, but the emotional intimacy was undeniable. They shared jokes, confided in each other about their struggles, and discussed things she had never bothered to share with me. One message, in particular, made my blood run cold. "You're the only person who really understands me, Michael. I don't know what I'd do without you." I felt sick. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just emotional, or had it crossed into something physical? I wanted to wake her up right then and demand answers, but something held me back. I needed more proof, more clarity. The next day, I made an excuse to leave work early and drove to her office. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched the entrance. Around 6 p.m., I saw her exit the building, laughing at something Michael, who I recognized from her phone screen, had said. They walked to a nearby cafe, their heads close together as they spoke. I sat in my car, my chest tight with a mix of anger and despair. The way she looked at him, the way she leaned in as if he were the center of her universe, it was a look I hadn't seen her give me in months. When she came home that night, she was all smiles, acting as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't keep up the charade any longer. "Who is Michael to you?" I asked abruptly, watching her face closely. She froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "What do you mean? I mean, why are you texting him at all hours? Why are you having lunch with him? Why does he know things about you that I don't?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she was going to confess. But instead, she shook her head and said, "You're being ridiculous, Jacob. He's just a friend." A friend. That word felt like a slap in the face. I didn't believe her, not anymore. The cracks in our marriage had grown into a chasm, and I wasn't sure we'd ever be able to bridge it. I didn't want to believe it had come to this. Hiring a private investigator to look into my own wife felt like crossing a line I'd sworn I'd never approach. But after everything I'd seen, the texts, the lunches, the lingering closeness between Laura and Michael, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. And I couldn't confront her again without proof. She was too skilled at twisting the narrative, at making me feel like I was the one losing my mind. It was late at night when I made the decision. Laura was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady, as if she had no care in the world. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning, until I grabbed my phone and searched for local private investigators. The next morning, I made the call. The investigator's name was Alan, a calm, no-nonsense man who spoke in clipped sentences and asked precise questions. When we met in his small, sparsely decorated office, he didn't waste any time. "What do you want me to find out?" he asked, his eyes sharp and focused. "I need to know if my wife is having an affair," I said, my voice cracking slightly. Saying it out loud made it feel real in a way that my suspicions hadn't. He nodded, as if this was the most ordinary request in the world. "Do you have any leads? Names, places, routines?" I told him everything I knew about Michael, about Laura's late nights and her sudden secrecy. Alan took notes without interruption, occasionally nodding. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair. "I'll start with Michael," he said. "But sometimes the obvious lead isn't the real story. You'll have to trust me to follow where the evidence takes me." I nodded, though the words unsettled me. I wanted it to be Michael. I wanted to confirm what I already suspected, not open another Pandora's box. The first few days were agonizing. Alan didn't contact me, and I didn't dare to reach out. I kept my phone close, jumping every time it buzzed, only to feel a rush of disappointment when it wasn't him. Meanwhile, Laura continued her routine of late nights and guarded behavior, leaving me feeling like a stranger in my own home. Finally, on the 5th day, Alan called. His voice was as measured as ever. We need to talk. Can you come to my office? I barely managed a response before hanging up and grabbing my keys. The drive to his office felt endless, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Alan was already seated behind his desk, a folder in front of him. He gestured for me to sit. It's not Michael, he said, opening the folder. Your wife has been meeting with someone else. His name is Daniel. He's a consultant hired by her company. Daniel? I repeated, the name foreign to me. I've never heard of him. Alan slid a photo across the desk. It showed Laura sitting in a cafe with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident posture. They were leaning toward each other, their heads close, laughing at something. They've met several times over the past 2 weeks, Alan continued. Cafes, parks, even a restaurant. But it's not just casual meetings. 2 nights ago, they went to a hotel. The words hit me like a freight train. A hotel? I whispered, my throat dry. Alan nodded, sliding another photo toward me. This one showed Laura and Daniel walking into the entrance of a boutique hotel, her hand brushing his arm. They checked in around 7 p.m. and didn't leave until the next morning, Alan said, his tone devoid of emotion. I've got the details if you want them. I stared at the photo, my mind blank. The image of Laura with this man, smiling, touching him, walking into a hotel as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was too much to process. Do you have proof of what they did there? I asked, my voice shaking. Alan hesitated. I can't say for sure. But given the circumstances, it's hard to believe they were there for anything innocent. I sat back in my chair, the weight of his words pressing down on me. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was evidence, cold and undeniable. Do you want me to keep following her? Alan asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I felt like I already had all the proof I needed. Or maybe I just couldn't bear to know more. When I got home that evening, Laura was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up as I entered, flashing me a smile that felt like a dagger. Hey, you're home early, she said, her tone light and casual. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I walked past her to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. My heart was racing, my thoughts a jumble of anger, betrayal, and confusion. I wanted to confront her, to throw the photos in her face and demand an explanation. But a small part of me held back, unsure of what I would do if she confirmed my worst fears. The next morning, I called Alan again. Do you have anything else on Daniel? Who he is, what he's doing with her? Alan sighed. I've got some basic info. He's been a consultant for her company for the past 6 months. Divorced, no kids. His work requires him to travel a lot, which might explain why he's staying at hotels. Anything about his relationship with Laura? I pressed. Nothing concrete, Alan admitted. But their body language in the photos is intimate. More than just colleagues. I thanked him and hung up, my mind spinning. The idea of Laura turning to someone else, someone she barely knew, felt like a betrayal of everything we had built together. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen. That evening, I tried to act normal, though every interaction with Laura felt like a lie. When she smiled at me, all I could see was the image of her with Daniel. When she kissed me goodnight, all I could think about was the hotel. I didn't know how long I could keep up the charade, but one thing was clear. Our marriage was no longer what I thought it was. And I didn't know if it ever could be again. When Laura walked through the front door that evening, she looked exhausted, her shoulders sagging under the weight of a long day. But all I could see was her walking into that hotel with Daniel. The image had burned itself into my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, it came back sharper and clearer, like a blade slicing through my thoughts. I had spent the entire day going over how I would confront her, rehearsing the words in my head until they felt like a script. But now, as she set her bag down and smiled at me, the weight of the moment settled heavily on my chest, choking the words before they could leave my throat. Hey, she said, her voice soft and familiar. You're quiet. Long day? I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the stranger I'd seen in Alan's photos. Finally, I spoke, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. Laura, we need to talk. Her smile faltered, and she froze, her hand still on the strap of her bag. "What's wrong?" she asked, though her tone told me she already knew. I gestured toward the couch. "Sit down." She hesitated but complied, her movements slow and deliberate. I remained standing, unable to bring myself to sit next to her. The distance felt necessary, like a buffer between her lies and my shattered trust. "I know about Daniel," I said, cutting straight to the point. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock, or perhaps fear. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching unbearably between us. "Jacob," she began, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know you've been meeting him. I know about the hotel." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. For a few moments, she just sat there, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs racked her body. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, her expression raw. "Yes," she whispered. "I was with him." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Hearing her admit it was somehow worse than all the evidence I had seen. The finality of her confession left no room for doubt, no shred of hope to cling to. "How long?" I asked, my voice hollow. 3 months, she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "But it's over, Jacob. I ended it weeks ago." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to me. "Over? You think that makes this better? You think that makes it go away?" She flinched at my tone, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear I didn't. It just happened." "Don't give me that," I snapped. "Affairs don't just happen, Laura. You made a choice. Every time you texted him, every time you met him, every time you lied to me, you made a choice." "I was lost," she said, her voice trembling. "I felt so disconnected, from you, from everything. And Daniel? He made me feel seen, understood." "Seen?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You think I haven't been here, trying to make this work? You think I haven't been here, loving you, supporting you, while you've been sneaking around with some consultant?" She broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. But her tears didn't move me. They felt like another manipulation, another attempt to shift the blame away from herself. I stood there, my fists clenched, trying to hold myself together as my entire world collapsed around me. "Was it worth it?" I asked finally, my voice low and cold. "Was he worth destroying our marriage?" She shook her head vehemently. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't about him. It was about me, about what I was going through. I didn't know how to tell you. And now you expect me to believe you?" I said, my voice rising. "After all the lies, after all the sneaking around, you think I'm just going to take your word for it?" "I love you, Jacob," she said desperately, reaching out to me. I stepped back, her touch repelling me like a live wire. "You don't do this to someone you love," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't betray them, humiliate them, and then expect them to just forgive you." She looked utterly broken, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The woman sitting before me was not the Laura I thought I knew. She was someone else entirely, a stranger wearing my wife's face. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil raging inside me. Her eyes widened in shock. "What? Jacob, please. We can work through this. We can go to counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't do this." "I can't even look at you right now," I said, my jaw tightening. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't even know if the baby is mine." Her gasp was sharp, like I had slapped her. "Of course it's yours," she said, her voice filled with indignation. But I couldn't bring myself to believe her, not after everything. "Prove it," I said coldly. She stared at me, her expression shifting from shock to despair. "Jacob, please. Pack a bag," I said, cutting her off. "Stay with a friend, a family member, I don't care. Just get out." For a moment I thought she might refuse. But then she nodded, her movements slow and defeated. She stood, her legs trembling, and disappeared into the bedroom. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, as the sound of her packing filled the silence. When she finally emerged, her bag slung over her shoulder, she paused at the door. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I know I've hurt you, but I still love you." I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I sat there, staring at the floor as the door closed behind her. The sound of her leaving felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. When she was gone, the silence of the house was deafening. I sat there for hours, replaying every moment of our relationship, every memory now tainted by her betrayal. The woman I had built my life with, the woman carrying what I thought was our child, had destroyed everything with her lies. Forgiveness felt impossible. Trust felt irreparable. All that was left was the hollow shell of what once was. And I had no idea how to move forward from here. When Laura walked out that night, it wasn't just the end of an argument, it was the end of us. The house felt quieter without her, but the silence didn't bring peace. It brought anger, sadness, and a gnawing emptiness that no amount of distractions could fill. I tried to focus on practical matters, telling myself that moving forward required action, not emotion. But every corner of the house reminded me of what I'd lost and how it had all crumbled so quickly. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney. Laura hadn't tried to come back or contact me, and I had no intention of reaching out to her. This wasn't something I could forgive, let alone forget. The betrayal had cut too deeply, and the only path forward was to sever ties completely. The legal process was grueling, but not as messy as I had feared. I think Laura understood there was no coming back from what she had done. She agreed to my terms with little resistance, splitting our assets, selling the house, and establishing a custody agreement for the child. Of course, there was still the unresolved question of whether the baby was even mine. We agreed to a paternity test, though I wasn't holding my breath for good news. A few weeks later, the results came in. The child wasn't mine. I stared at the paperwork, feeling a mix of relief and rage. Relief that I wouldn't be tied to Laura for the rest of my life, but rage at the extent of her deceit. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she had let me believe I was going to be a father, had let me invest in a future that was never mine to begin with. When I called her to tell her I knew, she broke down over the phone. I didn't know for sure, she sobbed. I thought there was a chance it was yours. Don't lie to me anymore, Laura, I said coldly. You knew, and you let me believe otherwise. She didn't respond, just cried softly until I hung up. I didn't have the energy to deal with her guilt or her excuses. My focus was on closing this chapter and moving on. The divorce was finalized within months. The house was sold as agreed, and I used my portion of the money to move into a smaller, quieter place on the other side of town. I didn't want to stay in the house that held so many memories, good and bad. As for Laura, she moved into a small apartment in a less affluent part of the city. It was a far cry from the home we had shared, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Word about Laura's affair spread quickly at her workplace. Apparently, Daniel's consulting contract had ended shortly after our separation, but not before rumors of their relationship had reached the upper management. Laura's boss, a no-nonsense woman with a zero-tolerance policy for office scandals, called her in for a meeting. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, Laura tried to downplay the situation, claiming it was a personal matter that had no bearing on her work. But the damage was already done. She was let go the same day. Losing her job hit her hard. She had always been proud of her career, of the independence it gave her, and now she was scrambling to find something else while pregnant. She called me once, a few weeks after being fired, asking if I could help her financially just until the baby was born. I almost laughed at the audacity. You're asking me for money? After everything you've done? Jacob, please, she said, her voice pleading. I don't have anyone else to turn to. Maybe you should call Daniel, I replied, my voice icy. He seemed more than willing to step in when it suited him. She didn't say anything after that, just muttered a quiet, okay, and hung up. I didn't hear from her again. The last I heard, Laura was still living in that small apartment, raising the baby on her own. Daniel, it seemed, had disappeared from the picture as quickly as he had entered it. Whether he had walked away or she had pushed him out, I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. It wasn't my problem anymore. As for me, I was rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. I threw myself into my work, into reconnecting with old friends, into rediscovering who I was outside of the shadow of our marriage. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of it all still pressed down on me, making it hard to get out of bed. But other days, I felt a strange sense of freedom, like I had been given a second chance to start over. The divorce had been a battle, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one where I could finally put the past behind me and focus on the future. Laura, on the other hand, had to live with the choices she had made. And though I wouldn't wish her situation on anyone, I couldn't find it in myself to feel pity for her. She had built her house of lies, and when it collapsed, she was the one left standing in the rubble.